It was just another busy morning at Lex. The airport buzzed with travelers rushing to their gates, dragging suitcases behind them, and waiting in long lines for overpriced coffee. But in the first-class lounge of Gate 27, things were a bit different. Snoop Dogg sat quietly in the corner, his tall frame folded into one of those fancy leather chairs. He wore a blue tracksuit with gold stripes, dark sunglasses, and a couple of flashy chains. Despite being one of the most famous rappers in the world, he kept to himself, scrolling through his phone, probably checking messages from his family or his business team. Flight 745 to New York, now boarding first-class passengers, the announcement came over the speakers. Snoop gathered his carry-on, a sleek designer bag, and made his way to the gate. A few people nudged each other and pointed, but most gave him space. That's how it usually went these days. Fame brought recognition, but also a strange kind of bubble around you. After handing his boarding pass to the smiling gate agent, Snoop walked down the jet bridge, ducking his head slightly as he stepped onto the plane. The flight attendant at the door did a double take but quickly recovered with a professional smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Broaddus. First class is to your right." Snoop nodded politely and turned right, finding his seat, 2A, a window spot with extra legroom. He stowed his bag in the overhead bin, settled into the wide leather seat, and went back to his phone. He had a big weekend ahead, a sold-out show at Madison Square Garden, plus a visit to a youth center in Brooklyn where he was helping fund a new music program. The man needed to rest before all that. The first-class cabin filled up slowly. A businessman in an expensive suit took the aisle seat next to Snoop, giving him a respectful nod before opening his laptop. An older couple sat across the aisle, the woman sneaking excited glances at Snoop while pretending not to notice him. A famous actress took a seat in the front row, her assistant fussing over her. Just before the main cabin began boarding, the cockpit door opened. The co-pilot stepped out first, followed by the captain, a tall man with graying hair and a stiff posture. The gold stripes on his uniform gleamed under the cabin lights as he moved through first class, greeting passengers with practiced charm. "Good morning, sir. Thanks for flying with us today," he said to the businessman in the suit. "Hope you folks have a pleasant flight," he told the older couple with a warm smile. He chatted briefly with the actress, complimenting her latest movie before moving on. Then he reached Snoop's row. The captain stopped, his smile freezing in place. He looked Snoop up and down, his eyes lingering on the gold chains and colorful clothes. "Ticket check," he said suddenly, his voice louder than it had been with other passengers. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The cabin went quiet. The businessman next to Snoop looked up from his laptop frowning. The flight attendant organizing drinks nearby froze, a bottle of water in her hand. Snoop slowly lowered his phone and took off his sunglasses, revealing tired but sharp eyes. "Excuse me," he asked, his deep voice calm but with an edge. The captain cleared his throat. "Just making sure everyone's in their assigned seats. First-class tickets are expensive." The way he said it made his meaning clear. He didn't think Snoop belonged there. He didn't think someone who looked like Snoop could afford it or deserve it. A young woman sitting behind Snoop let out a soft gasp. The flight attendant rushed over, checking the tension in the air. "Captain Winters, Mr. Broaddus is certainly in the correct seat," she said quickly, her voice professional but with a hint of nervousness. Snoop didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and held it up. "2A window seat. First class," he said. "Any other questions about my ticket, Cap?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Everyone watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Captain Winter's face turned a shade redder as he stared at the boarding pass in Snoop's hand. The first-class cabin remained dead silent. You could practically hear people holding their breath. "Well," the captain finally said, clearing his throat, "just doing routine checks. Enjoy your flight." He turned stiffly and walked away, but everyone had seen what happened. Everyone knew this wasn't a routine check. Snoop put his sunglasses back on slowly, his expression hard to read. But the slight tightening of his jaw gave away his feelings. After decades in the spotlight, he'd gotten good at keeping his cool when people tried to knock him down. This wasn't his first rodeo with prejudice, famous or not. That was completely out of line, whispered the businessman sitting next to Snoop, shaking his head in disbelief. I'd flown this airline hundreds of times. They've never once checked my seat assignment. Snoop just nodded slightly but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that reacting with anger would only make things worse. People would twist the story, call him aggressive, difficult. The headlines would read, "Snoop causes scene on flight," instead of focusing on what actually happened. A flight attendant with kind eyes approached cautiously, carrying a bottle of water. "Mr. Broaddus, I'm so sorry about that," she said quietly, placing the water on his armrest. "That's not how we treat our passengers, any of our passengers." Her genuine concern was written all over her face. "It's cool," Snoop replied, his voice lower and calmer than you might expect. "Been dealing with this stuff since I was a kid in Long Beach. Just didn't expect it from the guy flying the plane, you know." The woman behind Snoop leaned forward. "I got that on video," she said, holding up her phone. "Just so you know, that wasn't okay." Snoop turned slightly. "Appreciate that, but maybe don't post it just yet. Let's see how this plays out." The main cabin passengers began boarding now, filing past first class. Several did double takes when they spotted Snoop. A few pointed excitedly, nudging their travel companions. One brave teenager called out, "Love your music, Snoop," with a wave. Snoop gave the kid a peace sign, his first genuine smile since the incident. As the plane filled up, whispers about what had happened spread quickly. Flight attendants huddled near the galley, speaking in hushed tones and casting worried glances toward the cockpit. One appeared to be on the phone, likely speaking with someone higher up about the situation. The older couple across the aisle kept looking over sympathetically. Finally, the woman got up and walked the few steps to Snoop's seat. "My husband and I saw what happened," she said, her voice shaking slightly with age but firm with conviction. "We've been married 42 years, seen a lot of changes in this country. But some things still don't change fast enough, do they?" She patted his shoulder gently. "You handled that with real class, young man." Snoop thanked her with genuine warmth. Something about her grandmotherly concern touched him. She reminded him of the elders in his community who'd lived through much worse and still kept their dignity. The plane's engines began to roar louder as departure time approached. The head flight attendant, a tall woman with a professional demeanor, made her way to Snoop's seat. She knelt down beside him so they could speak privately despite the noisy cabin. "Mr. Broaddus, I need to apologize officially for what happened. It was completely unacceptable. The airline takes this very seriously," she explained. "We've contacted our headquarters. They'd like to know if you want the captain removed from this flight." Snoop looked surprised. He glanced around the cabin at all the passengers settled in with their bags stowed, their plans set. A delay now would affect everyone. "Nah," he said after a moment of thought. "We're all trying to get somewhere today. But I do have another idea." He leaned closer to the flight attendant and began speaking quietly. As he talked, her surprised expression gradually transformed into something else, respect, maybe even admiration. "That's unusual, but I think we can arrange it," she finally said. "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" Snoop nodded, his mind made up. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones. The plane pushed back from the gate, engines humming louder as they taxied toward the runway. Tension still hung in the air of the first-class cabin like a heavy fog. Captain Winter's voice came over the intercom for the standard pre-flight announcement, sounding strained and formal. "Folks, this is Captain Winters speaking. We're currently third in line for takeoff. Weather in New York looks clear, and we expect a smooth flight today. Flight time will be approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." The businessman next to Snoop snorted quietly. "Bet he wishes he was flying a different plane right now." Snoop just nodded, watching out the window as other aircraft moved slowly along the taxiways. His mind was elsewhere, working through what he planned to do once they were in the air. Word of the incident had spread throughout the plane by now. Passengers from economy kept finding excuses to walk past first class on their way to the bathroom, stealing glances at Snoop. Some looked sympathetic, others just curious about the celebrity in their midst. A young flight attendant passed through collecting last-minute trash before takeoff. As she reached Snoop's row, she leaned down slightly. "Just so you know," she whispered, "we're all on your side back there." She nodded toward the galley where other crew members were preparing for departure. What he did wasn't right. Snoop gave her a small smile of appreciation. Thanks, that means something. The woman with the phone who'd recorded the incident was still watching the cockpit door with narrowed eyes. She'd been texting furiously since they pushed back from the gate. My cousin works for TMZ, she told Snoop, leaning forward again. One word from me and this story hits their site in an hour. That pilot would be famous for all the wrong reasons by dinner time. Snoop turned to look at her directly. I get where you're coming from, but that's not how I want to handle this. There's been enough public shaming in the world lately. Sometimes that just makes people dig in deeper, you know. The woman looked surprised but nodded slowly, considering his words. The plane finally reached the runway and paused. There was a moment of quiet, then the engines rode to full power. The force pushed everyone back against their seats as they accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. Los Angeles spread out below them, a vast grid of streets and buildings gradually shrinking as they climbed higher. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the head flight attendant approached Snoop again. She knelt beside his seat. I spoke with the captain about your request, she said quietly. He was surprised, to say the least. Bet he was, Snoop replied with a slight smile. What did he say? Initially, he refused. Said it wasn't protocol and he needed to stay in the cockpit. She lowered her voice further. But I mentioned that the alternative might be a much bigger issue once we land, with videos going online and the airline having to make a public statement. Snoop raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said firmly. Because what happened wasn't right. Sometimes people need a push to do the right thing. She straightened up. He agreed to come out midway through the flight when the co-pilot can take over safely. The older woman across the aisle had been watching their conversation. After the flight attendant left, she leaned across towards Snoop. What are you planning to do, dear? She asked, genuine concern in her eyes. You're not going to cause a scene, are you? Not that I blame you, but still. No, ma'am, Snoop assured her. No scenes, just a conversation that needs to happen. The businessman beside him looked impressed. Most people would be filing complaints or threatening lawsuits by now. Snoop shook his head. Man, I've seen how that usually plays out. Everybody gets defensive, lawyers get rich, nothing really changes. I'm tired of that same old script. He glanced out the window at the clouds drifting below. Sometimes you gotta try something different if you want different results. As drink service began, phones throughout the cabin lit up with notifications. The story was spreading even without the video being posted. Passengers were sending messages about what they'd witnessed. A few reporters who followed Snoop's social media had noticed he was on a flight and were asking questions. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted. What started as an ugly incident was turning into something else, something unexpected. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen when the captain finally emerged from the cockpit. The usual boredom of a long flight was replaced by anticipation. Nobody knew exactly what Snoop had planned, but they all wanted to be there when it happened. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign had been off for a while. People walked up and down the aisles, stretched their legs, and chatted quietly. The movie screens showed different films, and the cabin lights were dimmed slightly for comfort. It felt almost like a normal flight, except for the buzz of anticipation hanging in the air. Snoop had been quiet for most of the journey so far. He declined the first-class meal, saying he wasn't hungry, and instead listened to music through his headphones with his eyes closed. But anyone watching closely could tell he wasn't sleeping. The slight tap of his finger against the armrest showed he was deep in thought, planning his next move. The head flight attendant approached again, this time with purpose in her step. She bent down next to Snoop's seat. Mr. Broaddus, the captain says he can step out in about 15 minutes if you still want to speak with him. Snoop removed his headphones. Yeah, I'm ready whenever he is. There's one more thing, she added, a bit hesitantly. He's asking if you prefer to talk privately in the galley area. Away from all this, she gestured subtly to the curious eyes watching their conversation. Snoop thought about this for a moment, then shook his head. Nah, right here is good. What happened right here in front of everybody. The conversation should happen here too. The flight attendant nodded with understanding. I'll let him know. The businessman who had been sitting silently beside Snoop for most of the flight finally spoke up. "I've been trying to mind my own business, but I gotta ask, what are you planning to say to him?" Snoop turned to look at the man. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know what I'm not gonna say. Not gonna yell at him. Not gonna embarrass him. Just want to understand why he did what he did, and maybe help him understand how it felt from my side." "That's remarkably generous," the businessman said, clearly impressed. "Most people wouldn't be so calm." "I've had a lot of practice," Snoop replied with a small, tight smile. The older woman across the aisle was listening in. "You know, young man, my husband and I were just talking about this. In our day, we saw terrible things happen to people who spoke up. It's good to see times changing, even if they haven't changed enough yet." Her husband nodded in agreement. "Takes courage to handle things the way you're doing. Could have just stayed quiet or gotten angry. Both would have been easier." Before Snoop could respond, a small commotion started at the front of the cabin. The cockpit door had opened, and the co-pilot had emerged briefly to speak with the flight attendants. Then he disappeared back inside, and moments later, Captain Winters stepped out. The cabin immediately fell silent. Even passengers who had been napping seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and stirred awake. Everyone watched as the captain, looking stiff and uncomfortable in his uniform, made his way down the aisle towards Snoop's row. Snoop sat up straighter, removed his sunglasses, and folded them carefully. He wanted to see the captain clearly, and he wanted the captain to see him, really see him too. Captain Winters stopped beside Snoop's row. His face was unreadable, a professional mask firmly in place, but his fingers fidgeted slightly with the cuff of his uniform sleeve, a small tell of his nervousness. "Mr. Broaddus," he said formally, his voice low but still audible to nearby passengers. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Snoop looked up at him calmly. "Yeah, I did. Thanks for coming out." He gestured to the empty seat across from him that the flight attendant had quietly cleared. "Mind sitting down for a few minutes? Kinda hard to have a real conversation with you standing over me like that." The captain hesitated, glancing around at all the watching eyes. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse and retreat to the safety of the cockpit. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, he sat down. "You got 10 minutes," he said, checking his watch. "The co-pilot can handle things, but I need to get back." Snoop nodded. "Won't take long. Just wanted to ask you something." He leaned forward slightly, making direct eye contact with the captain. "When you saw me sitting here earlier, before you knew who I was, what was the first thought that went through your mind?" The honest truth. The question hung in the air between them. Everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Captain Winters shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted around, noticing all the passengers watching, some openly, others pretending to be focused on their books or screens, but obviously listening. The question Snoop had asked hung in the air between them. "I don't think that's relevant," the captain finally said, his voice stiff. "I was simply doing a routine check." Snoop leaned back slightly, studying the man's face. "See, that's the thing. There was nothing routine about it. You didn't check anyone else's SEEP assignment, just mine." His voice remained calm, conversational even. "So I'm asking again, what was your first thought when you saw me sitting in first class?" The businessman beside Snoop had gone very still, not even pretending to work on his laptop anymore. The older couple across the aisle watched with open interest. A flight attendant hovered nearby, pretending to arrange something in a cabinet, but clearly monitoring the situation. Captain Winters rubbed his palms against his uniform pants, a nervous gesture. "Look, it's been a long day. Sometimes mistakes happen. I apologized, didn't I?" "Actually, you didn't," Snoop pointed out. "Not once." The captain's face flushed slightly. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. "Fine," he finally said, voice lowered. "When I first saw you, I thought you might be in the wrong section. You didn't look like my usual first-class passengers. Because I'm black? Or because of how I dress?" Snoop asked directly, but without heat in his voice. The captain looked down at his hands. "Both, I suppose." Someone a few rows back gasped softly. The woman who had recorded the earlier incident had her phone out again, though she wasn't obviously filming. "Thank you for being honest," Snoop said, surprising everyone with his measured response. "That's all I wanted, some honesty. Because we can't fix what we don't acknowledge, right?" The captain looked up, clearly not expecting this reaction. "I've been flying for 28 years, he said defensively. "I've never had a complaint filed against me." "Maybe that's because people like me usually just stay quiet," Snoop replied. "We deal with these little moments every day. Most times, it's easier to let it slide than to speak up and be seen as difficult." A flight attendant passed by, offering water to both men. The brief interruption gave the captain a moment to collect himself. "So what now?" Captain Winters asked after taking a sip. "Are you going to report me? Get me fired?" Snoop shook his head. "That's not why I wanted to talk. Losing your job doesn't teach you anything except to be more careful about showing your bias next time." He leaned forward again, his expression serious but not threatening. "I wanted to ask for something else. Something that might actually make a difference." The captain raised an eyebrow, cautious but curious. "What's that?" "I want you to make an announcement to the whole plane," Snoop said, "not to embarrass you, but to turn this into something useful." He held up a hand when the captain started to protest. "Hear me out. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about all these people watching and listening. It's about what they take away from this flight." The whole cabin seemed to be holding its breath now. Even people in economy who couldn't hear the conversation had sensed something important was happening up front. "What kind of announcement?" the captain asked, his voice guarded. "Just the truth. That you made an assumption based on how I look, you recognize it was wrong, and you're sorry. Simple as that." Captain Winters looked stunned. "You want me to admit to the entire plane that I profiled you?" "Yeah," Snoop nodded. "Because owning a mistake publicly takes real courage, and people respect courage." The businessman beside them nodded slightly in agreement. The older woman across the aisle leaned forward, watching the captain's face intently. "And if I refuse?" the captain asked. Snoop shrugged. "Then we go back to our original places. You fly the plane, I sit here, and nothing changes." But he paused. "I think you're better than that. I think you have the chance to turn a bad moment into something good." Captain Winters stared at Snoop for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly stood up. "I need to get back to the cockpit," he said. Everyone watched as he walked away, disappearing behind the cockpit door. The passengers exchanged glances of disappointment. The woman with the phone shook her head. "Well, you tried," the businessman said to Snoop. "Can't force someone to do the right thing." Snoop put his sunglasses back on without commenting. He reached for his headphones, apparently ready to return to his music. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Winter's voice came through the speakers. "This is your captain speaking. I have an important announcement to make." "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have an important announcement to make." Captain Winter's voice echoed through the cabin speakers. Everyone looked up, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even the flight attendants paused what they were doing. The entire plane went quiet, waiting. There was a long pause, so long that people started exchanging glances, wondering if the captain had changed his mind. Then he cleared his throat and continued. "Earlier today, before takeoff, I made a mistake. I approached a passenger in first class and questioned whether he belonged there, based solely on how he looked." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. In economy, people who hadn't witnessed the incident leaned forward, trying to hear better. That passenger was Calvin Broadus, known to most of you as Snoop Dogg. But his fame isn't what matters here. What matters is that I made a judgment based on appearance, and that was wrong. Snoop sat completely still, his expression hidden behind his sunglasses, but the slight tilt of his head showed he was listening carefully. "I've been flying planes for nearly 3 decades, the captain continued, his voice steadier now. "I'd always prided myself on being professional. But today, Mr. Broadus helped me see a blind spot in that professionalism. And rather than file a complaint or demand I be removed from this flight, he asked for something else, that I acknowledge my mistake openly and learn from it." The businessman beside Snoop let out a low whistle of surprise. The older woman across the aisle dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "So that's what I'm doing. I apologize to Mr. Broadus and to all of you who witnessed my behavior. It falls short of what you should expect from your captain and from this airline. The main cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the usual background noise of the engine seemed muted, as if the entire aircraft was holding its breath. "Thank you for your attention. We'll be beginning our initial descent into New York in about 30 minutes. The intercom clicked off. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the plane, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the applause spreading through the cabin like a wave. A flight attendant rushed over to Snoop, her eyes wide. "I can't believe he actually did it," she said. "In 20 years of flying, I've never heard anything like that." Snoop finally removed his sunglasses, a hint of surprise in his own eyes. "Honestly, I didn't think he'd do it either. Takes guts to own up like that." The businessman extended his hand to Snoop. "That was something special you just did. Most people would have gone for revenge, not redemption." Snoop shook his hand with a small smile. "Revenge feels good for a minute. Redemption lasts longer." The older woman's husband stood up shakily, using his cane for support, and shuffled the few steps to Snoop's seat. "Young man," he said, his voice cracking with age, "I fought for civil rights back in the 60s. Marched and everything. Got arrested twice." He placed a weathered hand on Snoop's shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder if anything really changed. Today, you showed me it has. Not enough, but some." Snoop looked genuinely moved by the old man's words. He covered the man's hand with his own. "Thank you for paving the way, sir. We're still walking the path you started." The cockpit door opened again, and this time the co-pilot stepped out. He scanned the cabin until he spotted Snoop, then walked directly to him. "The captain asked me to give you this," he said, handing over a folded piece of paper, "and to tell you he'd like to speak with you again after we land, if you're willing." Snoop unfolded the note carefully. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, respect, perhaps, or recognition of something genuine. The woman who had been recording earlier leaned forward. "What does it say?" she whispered. Snoop refolded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "That's between me and the captain," he said quietly. But the slight smile on his face suggested whatever was written there had meant something important to him. As the plane began its descent toward New York, the mood in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as an ugly incident had somehow become something else, a moment of honesty, growth, and unexpected connection between strangers sharing a journey. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time for the standard landing announcements. But everyone noticed the difference in his tone. More human, more present, more real. The plane touched down at JFK Airport with a gentle bump, tires squealing against the runway. Outside the windows, New York City's skyline stood tall in the distance, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, people started reaching for their bags, unbuckling seatbelts, and turning on phones they'd kept in airplane mode. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York," the flight attendant announced over the intercom. "Local time is 4:47 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." Snoop sat quietly, watching as notifications began popping up on his phone. News of what had happened on the flight had already spread online. Someone had tweeted about it before the captain's announcement, and now social media was buzzing with half-accurate versions of the story. The businessman beside him was scrolling through his own phone. "You're trending," he commented, showing Snoop his screen. #SnoopTeachUsPilot is all over Twitter. Snoop shook his head with a small smile. Wasn't trying to teach anybody, just trying to have an honest conversation. The seatbelt sign finally dinged off. People stood up immediately, reaching for overhead bins and forming the usual impatient line in the aisle. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual rush to exit, passengers were hanging back, watching Snoop, waiting to see what would happen next. The cockpit door opened. Captain Winters emerged, his cap tucked under his arm, his face solemn but composed. He nodded to the flight attendants, then made his way directly to Snoop's seat. The cabin went quiet again. "Mr. Broaddus," the captain said, extending his hand. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make things right." Snoop stood up, towering over the shorter man, and shook his hand firmly. "Appreciate you stepping up. Not everybody would have done that." The captain lowered his voice, though in the quiet cabin, people could still hear him. "I meant what I wrote in that note. My father was a pilot too, back when there were almost no black pilots allowed in commercial aviation." He faced so much discrimination, and here I am, doing the same thing to someone else. He shook his head, genuine regret in his eyes. He would have been ashamed of me today. Maybe, Snoop replied. Or maybe he'd be proud you owned up to it instead of doubling down. A flight attendant approached with Snoop's carry-on bag. As he took it, the captain spoke again. I know you have commitments in New York, but I'd like to continue our conversation sometime. My son's a huge fan of yours, by the way. Always talking about how you've reinvented yourself over the years, built businesses, become more than just a musician. Snoop smiled. Sounds like a smart kid. Smarter than his old man, sometimes, the captain admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. The woman who had recorded the incident earlier stepped into the aisle with her phone, but instead of filming, she held it out to them. Would you mind if I took a picture of you two together? People should see how this ended. The two men looked at each other for a moment, then nodded. They stood side by side, not quite friends, but no longer adversaries either. As they posed, the older man who had mentioned marching for civil rights shuffled forward with his wife. This is what progress looks like, he said, his voice carrying despite its age. Not perfect, not finished, but moving forward. When the picture was taken, Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to the captain. My manager's contact info. Have your son reach out. Maybe we can arrange something. The captain looked surprised. After how I treated you? Man, if I held grudges against everyone who ever misjudged me, I wouldn't have time for anything else, Snoop replied. Life's too short for that. As passengers finally began to exit the plane, many stopped to shake Snoop's hand or pat him on the shoulder. The businessman who had sat beside him throughout the flight was the last to leave. I've been flying this route every week for 15 years, he told Snoop. Never seen anything like what happened today. You changed things on this plane. He nodded toward the captain, who was speaking with the flight crew. And maybe for him too. Snoop shouldered his bag with a thoughtful expression. One conversation at a time. That's all any of us can do. As he walked through the jet bridge into the terminal, his phone buzzed with a text from his manager. How was the flight? Snoop smiled to himself as he typed his reply. Longer than expected, but worth it.